I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the breaking news we got this morning of Xi Jinping banning cryptocurrency transactions in China. What do you make of that, and what do you make about crypto more broadly?
Well, I'm not going to claim expertise in China's economy. It's obviously a much more controlled economy than the U.S., and it's interesting that he decided that that was necessary. I maybe didn't think it was necessary, but in any case, I'll just say a good thing to do. I don't see a real use for crypto, so I wouldn't go the route of outlawing it, but I would certainly want to restrain it. And I guess what I'd say first and foremost is to create good alternatives. And this is something that the economists have talked about for a while. The Federal Reserve Board could create a digital currency where everyone in the country and every business, that we have bank accounts with the Fed. And what that would mean is that instead of using checks, I know not many people are using checks anymore, but instead of having various transfers that we now have, which are often costly, that would allow us to make all our transactions immediately, costlessly. And I suspect that would undermine much of the value, much of the use of crypto. I mean, I just don't see, people are saying, oh, well, we could do this and no one's going to know about it. And go, okay, well, that's really good if you want to do ransomware. It's really good if you want to do drug deals, but that's not something I'm particularly anxious to promote. So what I'd like to, yeah, so what I'd like to see is the Fed adopt those accounts, which handles the legitimate purposes of crypto. And for the illegitimate ones, I'd say we'll figure out what to do with that.
You mentioned the pharmaceutical industry a little earlier in the interview. I wanted to ask you a question about that because both in 2018 and 2020, Democratic candidates certainly campaigned on lower drug prices. I mean, even Donald Trump claimed to want to do something about the exorbitant price of pharmaceutical drug prices in the United States. But now we're seeing Democratic lawmakers flat out reject allowing Medicare, for instance, to directly negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies, thus allowing them to essentially lower the drug prices for patients in the U.S. Where do you see this fight ending up? Because it seems like all the power and all the momentum is behind these more corporatist Democrats who are, doing right by their pharmaceutical donors.
Yeah. Well, my guess is you'll get something, not nearly as much as they should. One of the people who deserves to be singled out here is Kristen Sinema, of course, the senator from Arizona, because she actually ran on a platform of lowering drug prices and having Medicare negotiate. And apparently she's being a big obstacle to having that included in the reconciliation package. So maybe she changed her views, but you could have you could speculate on other motives she might have. But, one of the things people have to realize is drugs are cheap. And this is something, to my view, is a horrible, horrible scandal. Drugs are very cheap to manufacture and distribute. And we know this for two reasons. One is that just in the US, when a drug becomes generic, its price typically falls by about 95%. It's not overnight, but after a few years, when you've had a number of competitors enter the market, it falls by 95%. Now, just to be clear, everyone who's selling it at 5% of its at its patent protected price, they're making money. These aren't charities. So the point is that they could make money. They could profitably sell the drug at 5% of its patent protected price. The other reason we know this is we could look to countries where many of the drugs that we sell here aren't patented. It's much more difficult to get a patent in India than the United States. And oftentimes they'll have drugs, a famous one, Sovaldi, the hepatitis C drug, is a big breakthrough drug. It cured hepatitis C. So that was a very big breakthrough. But they charged $84,000 a year for it when it first came on the market. It was available for a few $100s a year. And just to be clear, India has high quality manufacturers. I mean, there's some that aren't high quality, but they're good manufacturers. They sell their drugs all over the world, including in the United States. So this isn't like you're getting something in an alley and you didn't know what was in it. So point just being that these are very cheap to manufacture and distribute. We make them expensive by giving drug companies patent monopolies. And again, the rationale, of course, is that we want to give them incentive to research, to do their research, develop drugs. So
that's how they invent stuff. They're compelled for profits. The profits is what makes them do the research. And without them, we would have no drugs.
Yeah, well, of course, the alternative is we could just pay for the research directly. And we already do that we spend over 40 billion, about 45 billion a year through the National Institutes of Health and other agencies. But also, Operation Warp Speed gave us some great models. We paid Moderna. We basically paid for the development of a vaccine. We gave them about 450 million to develop the vaccine and take it through the early stages of testing, and another 450 million for their large-scale clinical trial, which they then presented to the Food and Drug Administration for approval. So we just paid them to develop it, which was a great thing to do. But then we also gave them a patent monopoly, so said you could charge whatever you feel like. But the first part of that, just pay them to do it. That's something I think we should do. And then you could say, okay, and once it's developed, anyone who wants could then produce it. And if we had done that with Moderna, the shots would probably cost, I don't know, $4 or $5 a piece, maybe even less, because they really aren't that expensive to manufacture. But the point is that we would be able to produce a lot more and the prices would be lower and we wouldn't have these big arguments. But anyhow, I mean, I don't expect us to go to that system tomorrow. Maybe we'll never go to it. But the point here is that you could certainly reduce prices hugely from where they are today. And the companies would still have plenty of incentive. And insofar as they lack incentive, they're saying, oh, we don't really know if it's worth our while to work on Alzheimer's drugs or cancer drugs, whatever. Well, we could pick up the tab as we did with Moderna, put up more public money, and then we don't have to worry about whether they have enough incentive.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the CEO of Pfizer just sent out a company-wide email urging his employees to help defeat the, pharmaceutical drug pricing provisions in the budget reconciliation bill. And so, the way that you defeat it is you start donating money to anyone who might vote in favor of it, hopefully change their vote. But, the argument was used in that email about how this is going to hurt innovation. The people who really get hurt at the end of the day are the US patients. But I think that's a bunch of hogwash. I also wanted to quickly ask you about the supply chains, because we certainly experienced during the pandemic that our supply chains are pretty vulnerable. We had certain shortages early on in the pandemic. But at the same time, even as we're experiencing these things, pharmaceutical companies are offshoring our manufacturing jobs to other countries like India. Do you see that becoming a big problem in terms of making the US more vulnerable to shortages, or do you think it'll not really be a problem?
Well, there's a few points here. First off, I think there's been a lot of confusion on what are supply chain issues versus stockpile issues. So early on in the pandemic, of course, we had horrible shortages of ventilators, protective medical gear. Those are stockpile issues, because even if all that was produced domestically, it's not as though we would have had factories here. We could just say, oh, get us, 300 million masks next week. They still have to be produced. And that was a real failure of government. I know Trump made a point of blaming Obama. I guess he'd forgot he'd been president for 3 years, but we needed to keep up those stockpiles. So that wasn't a supply chain issue. That was a stockpile issue. Now, when we ask about the supply chains in the pandemic, we've had spot shortages, but frankly, I think our supply chains have held up remarkably well, because we're looking at a once-in-a-century worldwide pandemic. And for the most part, I mean, I know there's issues in many countries around the world, but here in the United States, people are getting their food. For the most part, they're getting what they need. I know there's exceptions that, I went to the store and I couldn't get the brand of rice I wanted. Well, it wasn't a tragedy, but, that was a supply chain issue. But for the most part, I think our supply chains have held up pretty well. So the argument that, oh, this exposed the fragility of our supply chains, you have really extreme events, you're not going to have any supply chain that will fully be protected. Now, in the case of the drugs with India, I guess I'm kind of agnostic on that. We need diverse sources. And just to make kind of the obvious point, we're going to see supply chains, we're going to see producers shut down in the United States. So we just had the hurricanes hit Louisiana. Well, much of our energy production, in some sense, maybe that's a good thing. We can't get oil. That may not be a bad thing. We should be consuming less oil. But in any case, point is that was a supply chain disruption that was just domestic, and that's going to happen. So we're going to have flooding. We're going to have hurricanes. We're going to have forest fires, earthquakes, and if our supply chains are all domestic, well, some of that's going to hit domestically as well. So we really need our diverse sources, some of which are in the United States, some of which are not. So the fact that they're producing in India isn't necessarily a problem in my view. you want to make sure is that you have diverse sources.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.